I like to start almost on time. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for bringing your kids out and having a kind of special homeschool session on creation. I don't know who was here last year, but I spoke here a year ago, and I'm a research scientist from Dow Chemical. Almost 30 years, I developed and invented new products. I have 17 patents where I've studied how creation operates. My specialty was plastic foams, styrofoam and polyethylene foam. Also developed some building materials where you mix plastic with ground up calcium carbonate, which is like rocks, and you form it into boards and you stretch it. And everybody's probably seen wood plastic decking for decks. Well, instead of wood, which discolors, this was made out of rocks and plastic, so it doesn't grow mold and it doesn't discolor. And when you stretch it, it pulls little voids, and the weight is much less and the strength doubles, and it kind of drills and cuts and sands just like normal wood, but it'll never rot or disappear. So it's a really neat product. Made lots of money for the company, but I got tired of inventing things and more passionate about trying to help the world around us understand that everything came from God instead of just making itself, which is what we hear everywhere in museums and in textbooks in public schools and universities. So here I am teaching, and I've been 15 years now speaking and traveling and teaching. Now, I've written a lot of books on creation. I'll talk about some of those at the end. After teaching and speaking for 30 years, I took all of these different talks, and there's probably about 30 different lectures I give. Some of them on genetics, some of them on geology, some on astronomy, lots of them on animals and biology. And I turned it into a video curriculum teaching series. It has 18 lessons, and I'm working on the next 6, so probably in a few years there'll be 24 different lessons. And I'll talk about that at the end too, but they're really visual. And instead of standing in the front of a church and talking with slides behind me, I traveled all over the country, to the Grand Canyon and to Mount Rushmore and Devil's Tower and the Petrified Forest and science museums, and they were filmed on location with lots of animation and lots of video footage instead of just someone standing with slides behind them. So they're really well done. The other thing I've done is I try to just provide tools so that you guys don't just learn about creation, but you can interact with your friends and teach them stuff too. Last year, myself and a co-author, we decided we're going to have a trivia game about both creation and all the prophecy, all the prophetic predictions that are found in the Bible. And there's just hundreds and hundreds of them. Lots of them have been fulfilled, they've come true, lots of those prophecies about Jesus coming, but there's a whole lot of them that haven't happened yet, and they're still going to happen as Jesus comes the second time and other things. But half the game's about creation, and I know you guys have heard a lot about creation, so I'm going to ask you a few questions out of the trivia game and see how good you are, okay? So everybody has to vote, okay? And they're usually like multiple choice. And I've got a question about astronomy, a question about biology, a question about discoveries that were made by scientists. Okay. And we'll just ask them and see if the majority of it get it right. And the fun thing is, you get to take turns reading the question, answers on the back, and then there's kind of this little few sentences that always pull people back to the Bible is where you find the right answers to things. So it's a way of sharing the truth with people that might not know it. So the first one is about astronomy. And by the way, what we're going to talk about is all through history, all of these ancient cultures that go back 3,000 and 4,000 years ago is when they started. They weren't like dumb, they were incredibly intelligent people, even 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. But that's the opposite of the way people are trained to think in our school systems. They think way back the further you get, the dumber people were. And there's a reason they think that, and we'll talk about that soon. But astronomy, here's the question. Egyptian astronomers who lived 4,000 years ago and Roman astronomers who lived 2,000 years ago both saw a star in the sky that we now know as Sirius B. That's what we have called this star, Sirius B. And it was known to be the kind of a star called a red giant. It's a huge star that is very red in color. Today, that star has collapsed to become a bright white dwarf star. So 2,000 to 4,000 years ago, it was red, just brilliant red. Today, it's just this bright white spot. How long do modern astrophysics books tell us it should take for a red giant to turn into a white dwarf? Do they say that should take about 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, or 1,000,000 years? Okay, so how many think, all the astronomy books say, for a star that used to be red to turn into a bright white star should take 1,000 years? If you think that's correct, raise your hand. Anybody? Okay, you gotta vote, okay? You can't just sit there and not vote. There's 4 choices. How many think 10,000 years? What does it say in the textbooks? 1, 2, 3. How many think the textbooks tell us that should take 100,000 years? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. How many think the textbooks tell us that should take millions of years? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, the majority of you picked millions of years. Here's the answer. According to textbook, well, before I give you the answer, I'll give you the answer first. According to textbooks, it should take at least 100,000 years for this transformation to take place, as it slowly changes from one to the other. But 2,000 years ago, this star described as redder than Mars by the Romans, that's how it was described. And the fact that it could change in only 2,000 years is a total mystery to modern physics. This reveals how much of modern cosmology is speculation, not established scientific fact. So it just kind of puts that little doubt into people's minds that everything they read isn't necessarily true. Okay, now here's an easier one. Biology. What animal shuts the acids in its stomach down, swallows its babies, and holds them inside of its warm, moist nursery stomach until they're big enough to crawl out of its mouth in order to care for themselves? So it eats its babies and holds them in its stomach. Is that the Brazilian crocodile, the Australian aquatic frog, the slime lizard, or the Russian coil snake? Which animal eats its babies until they grow bigger? Okay, how many think A, the Brazilian crocodile? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many think the Australian aquatic frog? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. How many think the slime lizard? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. How many think the Russian coil snake? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7. So I think the slime lizard won that one. Okay. By the way, there's no such thing as a slime lizard or a Russian coil snake. I just made those up. It's the Australian aquatic frog. These type of biological wonders testify to the genius of our Creator. The mother swallows her eggs and stops eating for 8 weeks until the eggs are hatched, transformed from tadpoles to baby frogs, and emerge from her mouth capable of caring for themselves. So it has to shut down his stomach and not eat for 8 weeks. How could it just slowly learn to do that? It's all been designed by God to amaze us. Last question. This is a physics question. In Job 28, verses 24 to 25, that were written about 4,000 years ago, it tells us that wind has weight. The wind itself has weight. That's the actual translation of the original words. Nobody understood that air had weight for centuries scientifically. In what century did Evangelista Torricelli discover this scientific truth, that air actually has weight and testifies to the accuracy of the Bible's scientific statements? Was that discovered in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, or 1800s? How many think the 1500s? Raise your hand. 1, 2. How many think the 1600s? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1700s? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1800s. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, 1800s. It was the 1600s. This was proven by experimentation in 1643. Torricelli was Galileo's student. So that's been 400 years ago. And that was kind of the epitome of modern science. And most early scientists were Bible-believing, recent creation Christians. So kind of, this trivia game has about 300 questions. I sold out of all of them, and the original version included 2 books, but just the cards and the timer and the discs sell as one of the 3 for about $8. So if you like the game, on your way out, make sure you sign up on my newsletter list, pay me for anything you buy, and then just kind of circle it, and I'll send it out to you this week. So it comes in a little box with all the question cards, and it's just a fun, really kind of a fun thing to do when you're driving in the car places, to take turns asking each other questions. So, okay. Now we're going to talk about the brilliance of mankind, but why? Well, first of all, 4 times, and if you were here Sunday, my sermon was really about the 3 most significant events in all of human history. But before human history even started, there had to be human beings. So I started by reading the final sections of Genesis 1. And I'm going to read them right now because we're going to come back to it at the very end. And this is just Genesis 1:26. God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, after our likeness." Now God is one entity, but he has revealed himself to us as both God the Father, Jesus was God, and the Holy Spirit. So he's also, there's 3 aspects of who he is that he reveals in 3 different, very distinct ways. So he refers to himself in plural here in the very beginning of the Bible, in our likeness. And let them have dominion or control over everything on earth, the fish, the birds, the cattle, everything on earth that creeps, every creeping thing upon the earth. So God created mankind in his own image. Now God uses himself as singular. So he refers to himself in both ways, singular and plural. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, God made them. 4 times God tells us people are totally, 100% diametrically, dramatically different than any other thing that's alive in the universe. God put his very nature into people, and he loves us beyond comprehension. And that's like one of the most important lessons in the Bible right up front. And yet the world around us, as they look at people, you'll hear over and over and over again that we're just an animal. We're just part of the animal kingdom. That is absolutely non-biblical. We're completely different. And at the end, we'll talk about some of those ways that we've been made in the image of God. But one of them, without a doubt, is our intelligence and our creativity. There's nothing like it in the animal kingdom. And that's what we're going to look at. And the reason is that it's so prevalent for people to think in terms of ancient people being stupid because we came from some sort of an ape-like creature, that it just gets drilled into the very thinking of how we interpret everything we find in all of archaeology. All of these ancient buildings and civilizations and tools, they all get promoted as supporting this idea that we've slowly turned into human beings. Completely different than what we're told in the Bible. And they can't both be true. So it's a really important topic, and to determine the truth and to show the truth to others, I think it's really important to understand how advanced these ancient civilizations were. Now, what we're looking at are the big events that have happened in history. The first one being the creation of everything, including people. The second one being, why does sin and death exist? Why do people die? Why do our bodies wear out? Why are there diseases? It's because we've rebelled against God, and if there wasn't death, we would forever be separated from him. So this is the beginning of why Jesus had to die, understanding why death even exists. The third big event was the worldwide flood, which created the rock layers and the fossils, and it wipes out this idea that there's been billions and billions of years of Earth history. Because the flood laid down all these rock layers and laid down all these dead animals only about 4,500 years ago. There's no evidence in those rock layers for millions of years because they formed rapidly and recently. So that can't be right. And that's a real hang-up for lots and lots of people because they hear it so often that things are really, really old. But I'd like to point out, how many of you believe that a bacteria could turn into a human being if you just waited long enough? And most people realize that couldn't be true. And yet it's taught as a fact by almost every biology teacher and every textbook in the world. So if all those people were wrong about that, why do we assume the geologists are right about the millions of years? They're just as wrong. And they're just as wrong for the same reasons. They're thinking in a way that leaves out God and the possibility of the flood. But today we're going to talk about, what about all the cultures? What about the Egyptians? What about the Chinese? What about the Incas? What about the North Americans? Every book you will read, every television show you'll watch, every museum you'll go to will place those cultures at 10 or 20 or 30,000 years old. They'll place the ape men and the Neanderthals living in Europe 20-some thousand years ago. They'll place the pyramids as having been built 12,000 years ago. They'll place the Chinese culture as having gone back 10 to 15,000 years ago. And it's all presented as an absolute fact. But if the flood was real, every culture on earth came from people that left the Tower of Babel. And the Bible clearly tells us that it happened in the range of 4,500 years ago. So none of these cultures can be older than 4,500 years. So there's this enormous disconnect. And there's an even bigger problem. There's only two possibilities for why human beings exist. You see, everybody sitting here, and me, we had mothers and fathers, and they had mothers and fathers, and they had mothers and fathers. And if you trace them back, you got to figure out how far back does it go. Or at some point, where did the very first two people come from that were truly human beings? Adam and Eve. Well, either one day on planet Earth, there were no people. Human beings did not exist. And the very next day, there were two fully grown human beings here on this planet. That's what the Bible tells us. One day there were no people. The next day, the very first two human beings existed, fully grown adult human beings. Now, to believe that in a university setting, if you go to any university and you come into the biology class or the history class or the philosophy class or any of the classes, and you would dare say, I believe that human beings just suddenly appeared on Earth, you will be ridiculed, laughed at, you'll be ostracized because it's considered ridiculous by the world around us because they've been trained to ignore that could really be a possibility. Now, there'll be a few Christians that mostly keep their mouths shut that will know it's the truth and agree with you. But people just don't say it. They don't talk about it because it's under such ridicule. Well, if it's not true that God just made people, then where did people come from? The only other possibility is that something that wasn't a person slowly turned into a person. There are no other possibilities. And that's the possibility that is promoted as an absolute fact. Why? Because the other option, that God literally made people, isn't allowed to be talked about in science classes and in public schools. And 95% of the people in our country are going to go through a public education system. So they're never going to get to hear about the God possibility. And when people and kids are trained to think in only one way, and they hear it over and over and over again, by the time they grow up, it's a fact in their mind, and they can't even consider anything else. You guys, one of the primary reasons you are being homeschooled is because your parents want you to hear the truth. They want you to be able to use your brains and hear all the evidence so you can know what the truth is, and that's not going to happen in a public school by and large. So your parents care that much about you, and never forget it. So we're going to think about this. The idea that we came from ape-like creatures. Okay, I'm going to back up. I'm going to show a little movie clip from a movie that was made 50 years ago. And it was called the most important science fiction movie ever made. Okay? It influenced more people, the experts, the Hollywood critics, they think, than any other science fiction movie that was ever made, at least up to that time. Any guesses what the most important science fiction movie ever made was? Any guesses? Planet of the Apes. That's one of the guesses. That's not it. Charleston Heston, Rodney McDowell in his monkey suit. Yeah, that goes beyond, way past a lot of these people. Any other guesses? Important science fiction film, really influenced a lot of people. That's the one. It was called 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, the concept of this movie, and it was based on a very famous book by a famous science fiction author, is that way back in Earth history, 1 million years ago, there were just all these animals running around, and some of them were apes. And apes were kind of one of the more intelligent creatures. And aliens sent this monolith. It's like a big temple rock structure. And at some point, this rock sent out a signal that gave one of these monkeys a really important idea. And that started the process of turning this monkey into a really smart, intelligent human being. And he evolved upward and into people. And for the first 10 to 15 minutes of the movie, there was no talking, no dialogue, nothing but a bunch of monkeys and apes running around screaming and screeching and yelling and throwing sticks at one another and sleeping in caves. That's all you saw in the first 10 minutes of the movie. And then you reach the most important moment of human history, when the alien gives the monkey an idea. Now watch the little section where that happens in this movie. And do we have sound? Is there someone back there that has sound on my computer? Hang on, because the sound is important in movies. Really? Okay. So here's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa. That's the alien structure, okay? And it just gave him an idea. Grandpa's digging in the bones for something to eat. Now he's looking at those bones a little bit different. He'd never thought of the bones this way before. And he's thinking about that bone. Notice the dramatic music in the background. Ta-da! What can I do with these bones? So he reaches over and he grabs one of the bigger bones. And he's looking at it. And he drops it again. Ooh, when I swing it, it makes things happen. When I swing it harder, it makes things happen. Wow, this is kind of fun, says Grandpa. Now he raises it up really high in the air and he swings it harder. Grandpa suddenly realizes he can use this bone as a tool. He can use it to hit things. He can use it to kill an animal. Grandpa's happy. Our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa has learned to use a tool. And he throws the bone up in the air, and we fast forward 1 million years, and the movie moves to a spaceship going through space. Okay, now that's the scene that's been set. Now, why is that? Why is that the most influential movie? Because movies impact our thinking. They're visual, and they tell stories, and they're dramatic, and they have music that impacts us, and the suspense builds, and it's reinforcing what's been taught for 100 years in the museums and textbooks, that we're nothing but an ape who has learned to use tools. And over time, our brain's gotten a little bigger, and our technology's gotten a little better. See, that's the implication. And that's why it influences the thinking of so many. And it's right there in front of us. And by the way, evolutionists will line up the skulls, and they found skulls in the ground that have little brains and bigger brains and sloped foreheads and ridges. And then eventually they get skulls that have bigger head brains and eventually have more straight foreheads. And they look really convincing when they're lined up in a museum. It really, wow, it looks like there has been this variation. This went all the way from apes to human beings. Well, if any of that is true, this whole story of animals turning into people, it means it has to be a fact that the farther back you go in time, the less intelligent people were. Their building abilities early on in civilization should have been much less developed. Their language ability early on should have been just grunts and screeches, slowly turning into language. Their social structures should have been less developed. Their inventiveness should have been less developed. That's what we should find as we look at ancient civilizations, if this is true. But all this ignores the other possibility that we were created in the image of God, therefore we were inventive, intelligent, and brilliant from the very beginning. So it's by looking at archaeology we can determine what is the truth. This is just another huge area to study, to know, and reinforce whether God's word is true or not. And furthermore, how do you fit all of human history into a 4,500-year time frame? I didn't even know how you could do that. I just assumed, well, it must be true, but I'd never really tried to figure it out. So we're going to look at all of that in the next hour. Now, what I do in both this book, and I took 2 years to research it and travel, and I went to Peru, and I went other places around the world, collected a lot of literature, read a lot of research reports. There was some really flaky stuff that involved alien technology that I would just throw out. But I discovered all sorts of amazing mysteries in ancient cultures that are just not showing up in textbooks. And I called this book Brilliant, Made in the Image of God. And it's just, people love this book because it's so different than most creation books. And what I tried to do was, like, every 2-page spread, I would have one topic and have a timeline at the top, and I would talk about where an artifact that's found in some culture would be placed in history of a biblical creation 6,000 years ago, about 1,600 years later, a worldwide flood, and about 1,600 years after that, the cross of Christ in biblical times, and so on. And then there's all these world cultures that have to fit somewhere in that biblical timeline of history. And where do they fit? So I divided into eras, what was happening before the flood. That was a big period of time, 1,600 years. Then the flood that changed everything. And then for the next few centuries after the flood, what was going on from 4,400 years ago to 4,000 years ago? What was happening from 4,000 years ago to 3,000 years ago? These things are so long ago, there's almost nothing left. We can't even, how many of us know what was going on, 100 years ago and 200 years ago? Very little. Most of us can't even name things that were happening with our great-great-great-grandparents, if we even know their names. So these are ancient history, but there are things we can learn from it. So I'm going to kind of walk through it in eras. So what can we know about what was going on 6,000 to 4,350 years ago? That would be, and I don't know is that's exact date of the flood, and I often round it up to 4,500 years, but in that range, okay? Essentially nothing. The Bible is so silent on it, okay? There was the fall, death or end of creation, everything changed, biologically, chemically, spiritually, everything changed. And by the way, God in chapter 3 of Genesis didn't say you will die on the day you eat the apple. He said, in the day you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. Now, that means in that time period, because it doesn't say on the day. That would mean that exact day. And day can be used as a period of time or a number, but in context, they began to die. And that was that era of their life where they brought death upon themselves. So anyway, essentially nothing survived the flood. It totally restructured this earth. I've heard people say the pyramids probably, were structures from before the flood. No, they're not. They're made of limestone. Limestone is a sedimentary rock that formed during the flood. So the very rocks the pyramids were built out of didn't exist until after the flood, made of stones that were formed during the flood. And they wouldn't have survived anyway because entire continents were swept flat. Mountains were eroded to nothing during the flood. The world was totally destroyed. So essentially no artifacts left. But memories in any documents that were considered really, really important, Noah was not a stupid man. He would have brought with him on the ark. So technology, abilities, history, I suspect Noah brought that stuff with him. And they were considered sacred and valuable and would have been passed down to the hierarchs of societies. And I suspect some of them ended up in the royalty of the Egyptian nation, which Moses had access to. So there's a good chance a lot of what he knows about ancient history in Genesis came via Noah into that culture. And he brought it with him. And after the flood, there would have been rapid civilization building for those who had access to lots of knowledge and lots of technology. And that's what we're going to see. Now, here's an example of what we could know that people knew before the flood. In China, about 30 years ago, archaeologists dug up a huge bronze sculpture. Okay, now this tree is, do I have a reference here? Yeah, it's 12 foot tall. Okay, so I'm 6 foot tall. This thing is twice as tall as I am. It is cast entirely of bronze, and it's estimated to be about 4,000 years old by the people that found it. And I think that's probably accurate. The people spread out from Babel, and we don't know exactly, but probably 200-300 years after Noah and his family started to repopulate, broke into different people groups. One of them ended up in China, and maybe within a few hundred years, some artist in China decided to cast this bronze tree. Now, this is an amazing sculpture in what it shows. First of all, its leaves are shaped like knives, and nestled in amongst the knife is a fruit. So you see these are like sharp knife-type structures surrounding a fruit. So it's kind of portraying a forbidden fruit surrounded by knives, or maybe a dangerous fruit, something surrounded by knife-like leaves that you wouldn't want to grab. So here's a forbidden or a dangerous fruit on a tree. And then, let me back up. There's a snake at the base of the tree guarding the tree. So you've got a tree with forbidden or dangerous fruit and a snake-like creature at the bottom. And lastly, there's a human hand reaching toward the fruit. I mean, it's got 5 fingers and knuckles and thumbs and fingernails. So here, 4,000 years ago, one of the earliest cultures to develop on Earth built a 12-foot tall bronze sculpture where there is a human reaching toward forbidden fruit with a snake at the base of the tree. Don't you find that stunning? They didn't have any access to the Bible. They had no access to the writing of Moses. They had nothing of a Hebrew knowledge of creation. And yet, here is this culture talking about humanity reaching toward forbidden fruit and being deceived by a snake-like creature. Because it's reality. It's a real event that happened. How did they know? Because these people came from the sons of Noah. And Noah had documents and knowledge that went clear back to Adam. If you look at how long people lived in the early part of humanity, they didn't have as many genetic mistakes. It was a much more favorable environment. They lived for hundreds 800 years, Noah's sons overlapped with the life of Noah. So Noah talked directly to Adam's sons. So he knew all this stuff. And I suspect he documented it. And he passed it on to his sons, who passed it on to their children, and it ended up in cultures all over the world. And the one thing the earliest Chinese wanted every subsequent generation to know is, why does death exist? Because we brought it upon ourselves. Because we rebelled against God and disobeyed his wishes. And we became sinful, and God is holy, and we could never have close fellowship again. Because all humanity is sinful, and God, as a holy God, must just judge sin. And that's why death exists. They didn't want the next generation to forget it. So they memorialized it in bronze. Because it's fact. It's history. It's reality. And there it is in archaeology. And that's just stunning. Now, another thing, while I'm on the Chinese, is this idea that languages slowly develop from grunts and screams and screeches. And then these ape-like creatures eventually started to assign meanings to symbols that meant certain things. And that's what a language is. Well, if you look at the oldest Chinese writing, and by the way, Mao in 1918, he took the ancient Chinese symbols and writings and he simplified it so it was much, much simpler than the ancient writing. So writing went from being very complex to being much simpler over time. Well, this is an example of ancient symbols of the Chinese writing. In other words, if you wanted to write the word anger, you wouldn't like English just combine certain numbers of letters that's spelled A-N-G-E-R. You would just take little swirls and swipes of ink, and you would create the entire word. So each symbol was a word. So that group of letters means anger. This group of letters actually means diarrhea. I don't know if you can understand that. And since you've got that, well, you've got to have the next one, which means toilet, okay? So, and on and on and on. It turns out, in order to read Chinese, and this is an early form carved on like a whale bone, they were very complex. They had 80,000 different sets of symbols. So in order to read, you had to memorize 80,000 groupings of symbols. Can you imagine how long it took to put your kids to bed singing the alphabet song at night? Wasn't just 26 letters, 80,000. Can you imagine the intelligence of people who could memorize 80,000 random, distinct sets of symbols? Except they weren't random. Hundreds of these groupings of symbols are tied directly to biblical events of history that happened before the flood. For instance, the Chinese symbol for garden, okay, this is what it looks like, the actual symbol that means a garden, a place of lots of plants that you would go to grow things, or it would be a beautiful place of peace. This little symbol right here, it's the one at the top, it's like an upside down T with an extra spot. That is also the symbol that means dust. So if you just see that, you know it means dust. The little square right underneath of it, and it's kind of a square thing that's been attached, that means breath. Something that has breath is alive. The little K thing means two people, and the big rectangle that is around all of it means an enclosure. So dust, given breath, to make two people inside of an enclosure is a garden. Where in history was dust brought alive inside of an enclosure? In the Garden of Eden. It's the story of the creation of Adam and Eve formed the very symbol of what is a garden. See, that's not random. That's knowledge of things that happened before the flood. And just one other example, and this was just stunningly clear. This symbol means any sort of vessel, okay, whether it's a basket or a floating canoe or whatever. It's a vessel that could float. That symbol is their symbol for 8, the number 8. And again, that symbol symbolizes actually people or things that are alive that have breath. So 8 people on a vessel is a boat. Where in history were there 8 people on a vessel? Noah's Ark. Noah and his wife, 3 sons, 3 daughter-in-laws, 8 people. Why not 10 people? Why not 2 people? Why not 12 people? Because it's an actual historical event that happened. And when the Chinese were building their language, they looked at what they had learned from Noah, passed to his sons, passed to their forefathers that migrated to China. And then they built it into their very language. See, these are the kind of things that show up as we study cultures that confirm the actual, factual, historical things that happened in Genesis. And it's not just in the Bible. We find them in cultures all over the world. Now, while we're talking about writing, again, I want to talk about just the creativity of human beings. It's so apparent from the earliest of cultures. Now, the earliest cultures on the earth that developed were the Chinese, then there were the Indonesia, Indian region, and there was the Egyptians, but in the same general time period, in 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, in Peru, the Peruvians were developing. So people literally sailed across the oceans and developed very early cultures early in the Peru times, okay? And they were the ones that built these enormous structures in Peru, and later the Incas and the Aztecs came along, and then they built on top of these original structures. But the Incas and the Aztecs, those people living in Peru and the ones before them, they had no form of written writing, but they still needed to transfer information across huge distances and from generation to generation. And they did it using a communication method called a quipus. Now, I've traveled to Peru and I saw hundreds of these in museums. And they find them in these ancient tombs all over Peru. Now, what a quipus is a cord across the top, and then they tie dangling cords from it of different lengths, and then they tie knots, a different number of knots, at different locations on the dangling cords dangling down. And then they assigned a meaning to each of these different cords. The length of the cord would have a certain meaning. The number of knots would have a certain meaning. The location of the knots would have a certain meaning. And potentially even the color and the type of cord that would use would have a certain meaning. Those would be like the letters or words in our sentences. So they would just have a cord, tie the cords to it, tie the knots, just like we're writing letters on a page. Then they would roll it up and put it inside of like a bamboo pole, and they would run that rolled up quipus all the way from one end of their kingdom over 3,000 miles to the other end of their kingdom, farther than from New York to Los Angeles. And they built a highway up and down over top of the Andes Mountains with stations every 20 to 50 miles. And they would just run their message and pass it to another runner, and he'd run it and pass it to the other runner. And the guy at the other end, he would just pull the quipus out, unroll it, and read it like we would read a newspaper. Isn't that kind of cool? It's so inventive. We don't even know how to interpret it anymore. We just find hundreds of these forms of ancient writing from this very, very ancient culture. So those are just some examples of what people were capable of from knowledge they had of events before the flood. Now, what really changed was after the flood. And to understand what's going on for the next few hundred years, you have to understand that mankind was struggling to just survive. On the entire planet, there are 8 people. I mean, it's a stunning thought. If something happened to the sons or the daughters, humanity would end. There would be no more people. If some accident happened to the girls or the guys, it's it. End of humanity, no more human beings ever in all eternity, unless God recreated all of the universe. Only 8. And it is a nasty place at this point. Noah had to get off this ark and just, I bet he was sobbing. Where did the beauty go? Where did everything go? The world was a mud flat. You understand, Noah sat on that ark after it landed on Mount Ararat for 5 months. He's sitting on this enormous boat filled with 2 of every representative kind of animal on the planet, 2 dogs, 2 elephants, two bats, two of all the kind of birds, and they're down there in the bottom of the ark, and they're pooping, and he's got to feed them, and the whole thing stinks. And he finally landed. We couldn't wait to get off. He waited 5 months because everything's just a mud flat. But it doesn't take 50 years for weeds to grow in your garden. Any of you have ever had a garden and you till it up in the spring and you plant your vegetables, within about a week you start getting weeds. So the whole world was also covered with seeds. But it took weeks and months for there to be enough vegetation for those animals to survive and the land to start to dry out. And meanwhile, there continues to be volcanism. There continues to be land movement. It's not like everything just immediately stopped and was perfect. This was a very, very hard world. And because the oceans were warmer, there was lots more evaporation that came down. There was lots more rain, lots more cloud cover, lots more dreary days. And that rain came down as snow because of warmer ocean water, lots of volcanism during the flood, lots of land movement, heating up the oceans, caused an ice age. So the ice age started right after the flood ended. It was not a pleasant, easy world to survive in. And hundreds of years passed before the Tower of Babel, ice age raging probably for the next 1,000 years as it reached its peak and then dropped back off and water flowed back into the oceans. During the flood, the ocean levels lowered. People built cities along the coastlines. When the ocean levels came back up, those structures got underwater. Europe and Northern America was under ice, and there was a wetter climate worldwide, and lots of continued volcanism and land movement and earthquakes. So this is the world for the next few hundred years mankind is trying to survive in. It sounds pretty difficult. It wasn't fun. Well, what developed? The most studied, the most documented ancient culture is ancient Egypt, because they built a thriving, enormous civilization. And it's considered to be the earliest human civilization that became very, very advanced, very, very rapid. So we're going to look at the ancient Egypt civilization. So in essence, here's the civilization that was the closest to ape-like creatures, because it's the furthest back that's well documented. Well, first of all, how did so many people get in Egypt so fast? And here's the question. Biblically, God revealed to him that he needed to leave his home in Ur and move. In the midst of moving and ending up in the Israel area, he passed through Egypt, and that was biblically about 3,900 years ago. And that's pretty well documented and accepted by everybody biblically. So Abraham lived about 3,900 years ago. The Bible puts the flood at 4,350 years ago. So that only left 450 years from the end of the flood until Abraham arrives in Egypt, and Egypt is a thriving culture. That doesn't seem like very much time. How does that even work? So I had to think about that. And you've got to make some assumptions. People would have been motivated to have very large families. And they lived longer. Even immediately after flood, they were still living in the 300 to 400 year range. But within the next 5, 6, 7, 8 generations, they were down to living only a couple hundred years. Abraham lived about 200 years. And Moses lived less, only somewhat over 100 years. So they were still living in the 200-year range by the time of Abraham. But early on, they probably lived 300, 400 years. Genetic deterioration. Generation after generation is worse than the one before. Well, even when I grew up, it was very common. In my neighborhood, there were 3 families. 2 of them had 8 children, 1 of them had 10 children. Okay, it was very common to have large families, even in my generation in the 50s and 60s. Not at all abnormal. And the record number of children, hope you didn't see that. I bet you did. I was going to ask. Since I showed it, I'm not going to quiz you. But the record for the woman who had the most children, biologically birthed children in her lifetime, was 69 children. One woman. She got pregnant when she was young. It's well documented back in 1765. Probably had twins or triplets for whatever reason every time. She was continually pregnant. By the time she stopped having children, she had birthed 69 children. And this is in modern times when we only live to be 80, 90 years old. These people were living to be 200 and 300 years old. So there were many, many people early on in the humanity who had very large families, without a doubt. And even today, if you can just Wikipedia how many, the record number of children for women, it listed, and this goes back 10 years ago, it listed 50 women who had more than 20 children in their lifetimes. So I just picked that number to be very conservative. Furthermore, as I said, people lived longer, there were less genetic mistakes, we had a stronger magnetic field that protected us from radiation from the sun better back further. There were less variations of bacteria and pathogens because every generation has more mutations and more diseases. So there was lots of reasons people would have lived longer and lots of reasons they would have had lots of children. So I picked 20. Let's assume that every couple that came off the ark had 20 children over 50 years. And that's not at all unreasonable. That's a very conservative estimate, okay? That means 50 years after the ark landed, there would be 3 couples, 20 children each, plus the original 8, there'd be 68 people on planet Earth. I suspect there would have been a lot more. Now those children are going to pair up and then have other children. And let's assume the next generation, each couple has 20 kids. So 100 years after the ark lands, you have those 30 couples, 60 pairing up, that's 30 couples, they each have 20 children. Now you have, and I'm just going to round it down and forget the original ones, they're still alive. Now we have 600 people on Earth. Those 300 couples have 20 kids each. Now you have 3,000 couples, 6,000 people on Earth. 200 years later, you have 30,000 couples, or 66,600 people. Now I arbitrarily stuck the Tower of Babel right there, 200 years later. I mean, with 60,000 people all living together, communicating perfectly, living as one culture in one area, you could have enormous building projects. And let's say they're afraid there's going to be another flood, and they want to build a huge tower that would give them a place of protection should it happen. And I think that's what was going on. And I also suspect it was a pyramid structure, because after people spread out from the Tower of Babel, we find pyramids and juggernauts showing up all over the world, pyramid-type structures. And I think it's because that's what they were building at Babel, and they took that idea with them. So if that happened 4,150 years ago, and they broke into 70 distinct groups, you divide 66,000 by 70, it turns out you'd have about 428 couples moving to Egypt, and 428 couples moving to India, and 428 couples moving up into Europe, and 420 couples migrating somewhere else. And these are the distinct cultures that started to spread out across the earth, each with its own language. God was slowing the spread of evil by doing this. Well, add another 50 years, they're each having large families. Now you have 4,000 couples. Another 50 years, you have 42,000 couples. 4,000 years ago, you're up to 400,000 couples in Egypt now, just in Egypt. You could have had 4 million people living in Egypt by the time Abraham arrived there. 42 million couples. Now, I don't think there were that many. I think there was already slavery going on. There was already diseases killing people. There were probably families that didn't have that many. The longevities were dropping off. But biblically, there's absolutely no reason to believe in just 450 years you couldn't have an enormous population in the land of Egypt. It's totally logical. The real question is, why aren't there way more people and way more graves and way more evidence if there have been tens and hundreds of thousands of years of human history? There should be, but there's not, because it hasn't been around that long. So that kind of explains where everybody came from, and it's very logical. But what about the pyramids? I think the Great Pyramids are the biggest ones. They're acknowledged as being the most intricate and the most skillfully made. As we move from the oldest kingdom of Egypt to the kind of the middle kingdom and the later kingdom, the pyramids are much shoddier, they're more poorly constructed, they're not as big. So the earliest ones were the most magnificent. And the big pyramid of Giza, I believe it was built right around 3,800 years ago, right after the time of Abraham, while the Israelites, long before the Israelites arrived. But while Joseph's family was there, okay, before Moses, it held the record for the tallest structure on earth for the next 3,600 years. It wasn't until the 1800s we built a building taller than the Great Pyramid. And it was unbelievable in its complexity. That one pyramid is made from 5 billion pounds of limestone, and there are 2.3 million blocks. And each of them is precisely cut and shaped to an exact size. They're about 6 foot long and 5 foot tall and 4 foot wide, rectangular blocks. And they were quarried and have been moved, most of them from a limestone quarry 500 miles away. Now here's the stunning thing. Egyptologists believe the Great Pyramid took 20 years to build, because it was commissioned when a new pharaoh, a young boy, took office as the god of Egypt, the pharaoh, and they started building his tomb, and he died 20 years later, and he was buried in this tomb, okay? So they all pretty much agree it took 20 years. Well, if you divide 20 years into that number of days, and that number of days into that number of hours, and you divide the total hours into 2.3 million blocks, it means every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, they had to place a block. And 5 minutes later, they had to get the next block in place. And 5 minutes later, they had to get the next block in place. 24 hours a day, continuously for 20 years, in order to get it all built within 20 years. I don't even think we could do that today. Every 5 minutes, they're quarrying, cutting, shaping, moving, and placing another one of those blocks. Unbelievable technology. And then they covered that whole pyramid with capstones. They were a smooth, white, bright marble surface. So this thing gleamed like a smooth surfaced pyramid from 26 miles away with the curvature. If you could see it sticking above the curvature. Now all that limestone's been removed and it's been used, the marble, all over Cairo for the ensuing thousands of years since the Egyptian empire fell. But each of these capstones were 12 foot long, and they were cut in this stair-step pattern underneath, and they had a perfectly smooth surface on the outside. So that pyramid looked like a smooth surface when it was capped with this marble. They were cut with an inaccuracy of 1/16 of an inch. Because if they were off, the next one would be off 1/8 of an inch, and the next one would be off 1/4 of an inch, and after a while they'd be off 1/2 inch, and after a while they'd be off 2 or 3 inches, and they wouldn't fit. So they all had to be exactly, precisely cut in this stair-step fashion. And the whole pyramid had to be on a base that was flattened, so there was less of a slope than 0.001 inch per foot of width. Because if it had this up and down slope, then those blocks wouldn't have rested flat, and as they stacked them, the whole pyramid would be increasingly warped and out of kilter. To get, that's 1 mil, that's 1,000th of an inch. To get that accuracy today, we have to send metal plates to a computer-driven CNC machine shop with specialty equipment. And they leveled an entire 14-acre base of ground to that accuracy. And then, this is even more stunning, they placed the pyramid exactly 1/3 of the way from the equator to the North Pole, and that's called, it's a very important prime meridian location. And to know that location, you have to know the diameter of the Earth. So they had mathematicians that knew the Earth was circular and knew what the diameter of the Earth was and knew exactly where to put the pyramid. And then they lined it up with the magnetic field of the Earth in a perfect north-south direction along the axis of the pyramid. And the pyramid's within 2% of a single degree of the compass. So it's only 2% off of 1 degree. Now, in 1859, we built the Greenwich Observatory in Greenwich, England, and we tried to line that observatory up with the magnetic field of the Earth, perfectly north-south, we came within 6% of a single degree. So almost 4,000 years later, using all of modern technology, of modern man and modern science and modern ability and instrumentation, we were 3 times less accurate than the people building a structure at the very beginning of human civilization. You're starting to see the implication? These guys had technology that came from 1,500 years of knowledge that came before the flood, and they put it to use. And as their civilization fell, that knowledge got lost. And it took us thousands of years to redevelop it. That's the truth of humanity. So there's the people who had the most access to technology that came through the ark and started to develop the Egyptian culture. And that's reality, and that is fact. Meanwhile, there are other people who are being pushed to the fringes of human civilization, didn't have access to that technology, and were eking out an existence during a raging ice age in northern and southern Europe. And these were the people we call Neanderthals. And we consider them like ape people and stupid and just grunting and eking out an existence. Well, these Neanderthals, as I said, they lived during an ice age. They lived in caves because those were shelters they could find easily. It's very logical. But they were incredibly intelligent and compassionate. These weren't just apes. They were big and brutish and muscular, and they had somewhat different facial structures than we have, but they weren't stupid, and they looked totally human. And by the way, we've now acknowledged throughout the scientific community that Neanderthals were 100% totally, fully human, with just slight variations of characteristics like other people all over the planet. They cared for their elderly. They would bury them with beautiful artifacts and flowers in their graves. They would find people who had broken bones that had not yet healed that they took time to take care of instead of just rejecting them. They would bury useful tools and spears and things they could have used to survive with their dead, indicating they believed something came after this life. They realized death isn't all there is. They hunted in complex coordinated hunting parties to bring down woolly mammoths and huge great game herds. Now, they were also brilliantly inventive. Now they lived in a tough time where there were animals that existed during the Ice Age that have since went extinct, like saber-toothed tigers. And if you're like a Neanderthal guy, and you're going to go out hunting, and you see a saber-toothed tiger coming at you, and you pick up your spear, and the arrowhead falls off of your wooden spear, that's not a good day. I mean, you're in big trouble with this big old tiger coming at you when your arrowhead falls off your spear. Well, they found some spears in these tombs that were so strongly bonded. I mean, the actual stone head on that spear was bonded to the wood by the glue, an adhesive, that they couldn't get it off without breaking away the wood. It was, it was wrapped with leather straps. It was literally bonded to the wood. So the scientists started to think about this. How did this guy, this ape guy, figure out how to glue this stone arrowhead to this spear? And they started to analyze the glue. And they realized it was the sap of a tree, like some sap is really sticky. But sticky doesn't make it bond. They had chemically heated it up, kept oxygen away so it didn't burst into flame, and it had chemically changed so it would literally bond to both the stone and the wood and glue the arrowhead really, really strongly there, and then they would wrap it in rawhide. And it was a really, really what they called super glue. But the only way it would work is if they heated it exactly the right amount for exactly the right amount of time. So the scientists tried to duplicate it. They chemically analyzed it. They knew what kind of tree sap it was. But every time they would heat it up, if they heated it too hot, it would burst into flames. If they didn't heat it enough, it wouldn't cross-link and it wouldn't work. If they heated it too long, it would char and turn black and be no good. If they didn't heat it long enough, then it wouldn't become adhesive enough. So they worked on it for months and months and months, and they were trying to figure out how in the world they did it. So they would bury it under the ground, under a rock, and they would put a fire on top of the rock. And they finally succeeded in making just like 1 ounce of this glue that worked just like they expected it to work. But the only way these scientists were able to duplicate what these Neanderthals had done was to use all sorts of modern instrumentation and bury electronic thermocouples in there and control the amount of heat on top of the rock with all sorts of modern technology. Then they were able to duplicate this glue. But these guys did it without all of that modern technology. So you have to ask yourself, who was really the most intelligent? The one who was able to do this originally without all of our technology, or the one who figured out to do it using a bunch of technology that we already have? I think these guys were every bit as intelligent as us. They just didn't have the tools to work with that we have. But they were able to accomplish all these things. And they're incredibly artistic. You look inside of their caves, they're just covered with these colorful drawings that are exact representations of the animals they were hunting. And they even showed the exact stride in the way horses would run and lifting the right feet at the right time. So they are incredibly observant. And you find these cave drawings in France and in Germany and in the Netherlands and even in South Africa and Australia. All these ancient people had all this artistic ability. Now, if you're a stupid caveman, why are you wasting your energy and time doing artistic activities? It's because it's reflecting the intelligence and creativity of God. So those are the kind of things going on almost immediately at the get-go after the flood. Surviving, but also with intelligence, or building advanced civilizations, depending on your access to ancient technology before your time. How about the next 1,000 years? This period is characterized by rapid, massive building projects. We find civilizations popping up all over the world, and they're immediately building enormous, huge structures. They have advanced languages and diverse cultures, and they're just suddenly there. Now, I'm going to show you an artifact that is absolutely stunning in its implications. And it's a map that was found, let's see. It was found in 1513, and it was found in Italy, but it traces its roots back to a Iranian naval captain who compiled the information. So where did the information on this map come from? I'm going to tell you what the map shows in a second. Well, I think the most logical explanation for it is that the information used to draw this map came from much older information that goes all the way back to the Library of Alexandria. And the Library of Alexandria was along the coast of Africa near Iran, and it contained 1 million scrolls. This is the place where when Alexander from the Roman Empire was in love with Cleopatra from Africa, he donated, I believe, close to 1 million books written on scrolls to this library as a sign of his love to Cleopatra. It's one of those things out of history. But that library burnt down about 2,000 years ago, but it contained all sorts of ancient information that I think could have went all the way back to the time of Noah and the people after the flood. Now, here's what the map looks like. Let me, right there. You'll notice it shows the shoreline, and this is all ocean down this way, and it shows various things along the shoreline, and it's got a whole bunch of notes down here at the bottom that denotes certain things that are seen along these shorelines and the conditions. Now, turns out what this map shows is a very accurate reproduction of exactly where the shoreline of Antarctica is and where the ocean starts. Okay? That's what it shows. The trouble is, ice covers Antarctica about 200 miles out beyond where the land ends and the ocean starts, and the ice never melts. It's some of the places it's a mile thick of ice. So if the Ice Age, and we're told in every textbook, in every museum in the world, that the last ice age on Earth, and there's only been one, it's a lie that there's been multiple ice ages, but we're told that Ice Age started about 200,000 years ago, and it slowly started to peter out and ended about 12,000 years ago. and it's still covered with ice. So no human being supposedly existed before 100,000 or so years ago. We were still apes 100,000 years ago. So no human being has ever seen the coastline of Antarctica because it's been covered by ice for over 200,000 years. And yet here's a map showing where that land surface is. Now this map was sent in 1968 to the cartography department of the United States Air Force. And a colonel wrote back, the person that had sent him this map, and he said, this map accurately shows where the land surface under the ice is in Antarctica. It's an accurate map of that surface, which we haven't known until we did sonar mapping in the 1950s. And he said, we have no idea how that could be the case, but that's what it shows. Isn't that interesting? How? That's a mystery. Well, here's the biblical explanation. And by the way, in the little notes at the bottom, it says, this area has a warm climate. Antarctica has a warm climate in the footnotes of the map. After the flood of Noah, the oceans of the world were all heated up by all the volcanism, all the land movement. It was driving the ice age. It was evaporating lots more water. And people were exploring this new world. Within hundreds of years, they were building boats. They were moving to other areas of the earth. They were developing civilizations all across the planet. The people had already started to arrive in South America and build the Inca Empire. And they were documenting what they found this new planet looked like. And for hundreds of years, maybe for 500 years or more, the oceans are slowly cooling down and cooling down and cooling down. The coastline of Antarctica would have been exposed. And those ancient explorers, those first people after Noah, they would have documented these things. And those documents would have been passed down, and they would have been passed down. And I think some of them would have ended up in the Library of Alexandria. And ancient naval people would have had information, access to these, and they would have made copies. And eventually, one of those copies is found in some old monastery in Italy in 1513. See, it's a totally logical explanation for how this could exist. And it completely destroys the time frame that the world is teaching about the Ice Age and how old things are. So these evidences are just stunning. And this is, whoops, wrong way. That's what it looks like today. I mean, the land surface is like 20 miles back here, continuously covered by ice. No one could have seen it. And yet there it is on that map. I'm just going to jump fairly quickly through a few more. In Peru, 3,600 years ago, they were building walls. And look at what they would do. They would take a block, and this one probably weighs 500,000 pounds. And they would move it from 100 miles away up and down a mountain and back down the next side of the mountain until they found where they wanted it in a valley area. And then they would cut this block in an exact jigsaw puzzle shape so you couldn't even fit a credit card between the crack. Water doesn't even leak through between the blocks. They're that perfectly cut. We have no idea how they did it. It's still a huge controversy. How did they transport them, and how did they so accurately cut them? And this way predates the Inca Empire. This was the earliest, and we find these monolithic, mono meaning single, huge blocks of stone, lithic meaning stone, huge block of stone structures. That one's 400,000 pounds, unknown origin. But look at the size of this one. Absolutely humongous blocks moved and placed to form these structures. Even in North America, we find these Indian mounds, and they go back way predating modern Indian tribes. There were ancient Native Americans that were building sacred burial mounds, and they were often shaped just like big hills. These are grave robbers trying to find treasures inside of these mounds. This is a picture from the 1800s. Here's one in Ohio that's shaped like a snake. There's his mouth, and the mound just winds around. It's about the size of a football field. There's another one in southern Ohio. Here's a big pyramid-shaped mound in Marietta, Ohio, and there's others. Well, let's see, do I have a date on this? I document this in the book, Brilliant, but there was a man named Eisenhower. He collected a bunch of brass plates and a bunch of slate plates that were dug out of these Indian mounds. Now, we don't know how old they are, but then he documented them in 1903 and published a book, and you can still find copies of, or photographic impressions of this book on the internet. And this is one of those plates. It shows a bunch of symbols, kind of reminds you of hieroglyphics. Then it shows a pictorial depiction of people drowning, a huge boat, and 1, 2, 3, 4 men worshiping, raising their hands, coming off the boat with animals. And this is found in an Indian mound in Ohio that's thousands of years old. Now, this is immediately rejected as nothing but some sort of forgery by the world around us. Somebody just threw a fake thing into this mound, or whoever found it lied about having found it, and you can't prove it one way or another. So it could be, but biblically, there's no reason to just reject it for no reason. And the people who documented it testified that it was real. So who knows? But it's just one of those indications that things fit biblically that the world doesn't have an explanation for, so they just reject it out of hand. In Peru, they were doing things like elongating skulls. They liked people with long, pointy heads. So they would take royalty and priests, and they'd take the babies, and they would slap boards on the sides of their heads on 4 sides and then tightly bind it. So the only way the plates of the skull could move as the baby grew was outward and upward. And they found in tombs all sorts of skulls that are elongated like this as adults. Just kind of interesting that they could do this. And here's an x-ray of one from a tomb. And that's what that guy's head looked like. So lots of manipulation of the human body. But more interestingly, here's a burial stone showing 2 ancient Peruvians getting ready to cut a hole in the skull of a human being. They have found hundreds of skulls, and here's 2 of them in the museum I took pictures of, that they have had a hole cut in their skull. Now, this is 3,000 years ago, okay? This isn't modern science. And then they've inserted a metal plate inside of the skull. And the bones, like this one, I've got a close-up. There's that one. The bone has refused itself and grown around this gold plate after it's been cut. So these people survived. We don't know why they did it. I don't know if they had brain tumors or they were just experimenting with what happened when they probed around in people's brains. But they were able to do brain surgery, and the people survived. And not just once, but dozens and dozens of times. In ancient Greece, this is an artifact found in the National Museum of Athens, Greece, and it's considered one of their national treasures. And it goes back 3,100 years ago, way back in the early Greek civilization development time period. And it is incredibly significant. In the year 2000, okay, that's the end of a whole 1,000-year period of human history, from the year 1000 to 2000, Time magazine and Life magazine, they polled all the historical experts and they asked, in that 1,000-year period, who was the human being that most impacted and influenced the development of all humanity across the entire planet? The most important individual in a whole 1,000-year millennium. And lots of people wrote in, but pretty much there was universal agreement that the human being who had the most impact on humanity in the last 1,000 years was Gutenberg, the man who invented the printing press. Because that allowed knowledge to be captured and passed from generation to generation. It drove the Reformation of Christianity. It drove the scientific revolution. It drove everything that followed for hundreds of years after the printing press was developed. Because you could put type in a tray, put ink on top of the type, and make copy after copy after copy and mass produce information. Except Gutenberg didn't invent it. The Greeks were doing it 3,000 years earlier. Okay? What they did, actually 2,500 years earlier, the 1500s from 3,100 years would be 2,500 years. They made type with different symbols. They put it in a circular tray, arranged it in a certain way to read a certain message, and then they would just press soft clay on top of it, it would grab the impression, and then they'd go bake that clay in order to make copy after copy after copy of that information. The idea of typesetting didn't come in the 1500s. It came 2,500 years earlier, in an earlier civilization. It was just rediscovered by the modern world. I'm going to just jump past these. In Costa Rica, there are thousands of huge, perfect, this picture's been stretched a little bit, but it's a perfectly circular marble, 6 foot in diameter. And they found some of these huge, perfectly circular spheres that weigh up to 30,000 pounds, 300 miles offshore on islands offshore, from stone that's been built onshore. Now, the textbooks will say these were carved, about 1,000 years ago by the civilization that lived in Costa Rica 1,000 years ago. But the trouble is they don't have the right tools, they don't have the technology, and they only had little dugout canoes. How do you put a 30,000 pound marble on a dugout canoe and row it 300 miles out to an island? You can't. There was a previous civilization with technology that we don't even know how they did it, and we don't know why they did it. But there's all these ancient cultures with all these abilities. Now, real quick, and I'm about to wrap up, we're getting to modern times. We're getting to the Roman period. We're getting to the period leading up to Jesus. We're getting to lots of technology that's now even more advanced. The Romans were building amphitheaters, and they put them everywhere they went, with incredible acoustics. And the University of Houston did a study a few years back where they understood that spoken words have a certain vibrational frequency, and it's not just the shape of the amphitheater, it's the actual structure of the seats and the placement of the seats and even the material that it's made out of that dampens like the wind and random noises and accentuates human speech. And the whole thing's designed in a marvelous acoustic way in order to accentuate human speech. And you see these amphitheaters everywhere. In ancient Iraq, we found dozens of batteries. They literally had electric batteries about 2,200 years ago. They have an anode and a cathode. They were filled with an electrolyte. They've unearthed multiple examples. Mythbusters had a show where they wanted to discover, do these batteries really work? And then they reproduced them, they even linked them up, and they showed that you could use them to do electroplating. You could build up enough voltage just by linking them up to electroplate items. And by the way, one of the mysteries is how they got such thin coatings of metal on top of some of this ancient jewelry. Now, it hadn't been proven, but this is one of those possibilities. But the technology was there. Ancient culture. Last example. In ancient Greece, now we're not back 2,100 years ago, they found a shipwreck in the Mediterranean in 1901, and it was filled with coins and pottery, and then they had these encrusted gears, okay? Just this chunk of gears that were encrusted with coral and stuff. And it got thrown on a shelf. Well, in 1971, some researcher pulled it off the shelf, did some X-ray analysis, and found out there was 82 different fragments. It was actually 30 perfectly formed and shaped intermeshing bronze gears inside of this mechanism. And there was all this debate, what was it used for? And they spent, long time. The study that finally came to a conclusion from 1971 to 2006, so almost 30 years studying it, they reproduced exactly what this thing did. It was debated, is it a clock? Is it some sort of a compass? Is it some sort of a thing for studying the location of the Earth? And here's a quote from the Michael Edmonds, who ran the team up in Canada, Cardiff University, came out with the results of his study. He said, this device is extraordinary, the only thing of its kind, beautifully designed. Here's the clue, its astronomy is exactly right. The way it's designed makes your jaw drop. Whoever built it was extremely careful. In terms of history and scarcity, it's more valuable than the Mona Lisa. Now, we've only found one of them, but that doesn't mean there wasn't others. We just had, the technology has been lost. They reconstructed a replica of what they thought it looked like On the back, it would have a series of handles with a little pointer that would point to a certain spot with a label. On the other side, it had a label that would point to a bunch of dates, months and years and dates. So you crank the handle to some date, like February 1st of 100 years ago, okay? A year and a date. Then you'd look on the other side to where the hands pointed to, and it would tell you the position in the sky where you would find Mars, Venus, Saturn, and Jupiter, the visible planets. So any day in the past or any day in the future, you could pick a date and you would know where in the sky to look to see those planets. Isn't that phenomenal? And this was over 2,000 years ago. Anybody here think they could build such a machine? These people were brilliant. And if they could cast bronze to do that 2,100 years ago, they were probably doing it hundreds and hundreds of years before that. It just didn't appear suddenly. So people have always been incredibly intelligent. So what happens when instead of acknowledging that the Bible is true and we've been created in His image and that's why we exist and that's why history is what it is, we start to pretend that we're just apes and we can make up our own rules? Everything becomes relative. My opinion's as good as yours. If I can get people to agree with me, it must be right. The scientific consensus must lead to absolute truth. That's the way people start thinking. And therefore, the most convincing, the most capable of communicating in a way that sways people is going to be the person who rises to the top elevation and becomes the ruler over the others. And it doesn't matter whether he's right or true or compassionate or kind. It's just, does he have the talents to convince the most to support him? Everything becomes relative. Morality degenerates. Leave God out, it's whatever benefits me that becomes the most expedient. Life becomes cheapened because we're not made in the image of God, we're made in the image of a monkey. And we're just another biological thing. And every society ultimately falls apart. And that is the history of humanity throughout this planet. Every society falls apart because we're all sinful. We're all easily deceived and swayed. And we don't even know if what we believe is right unless we have an absolute source of truth and knowledge to guide us. And that's what God's Word is. And that's why this subject is so important. And the only place I want to end is God said 4 times He made us in His image. And I think every part of Scripture has multiple levels of truth attached to it. There's the big levels and then there's the little minute levels. And I just wonder if there's 4 major ways that we're made in God's image. And I picked my list, and it may not be the definitive list, but the final page of this brilliant book talks about that. And I mentioned that our creativity, I think, is that God-given thing that differentiates us from animals. Our ability to communicate, it transcends all cultures and all time and all people. I mean, babies learn to understand almost from the get-go, and they're understanding you long before they can talk. They get what you're saying. And all people, through all time, rapidly start attaching meaning to some sort of symbols in order to have some sort of written, captured communication. They had a group of deaf children. This is one of the pages in one of the devotionals. There were deaf children that were housed together down in South America in an orphanage. And researchers were stunned that after living together for about a year, this group of deaf children had developed their own unique language, written language, that was totally unique from any other language that had ever been seen. Children developed a written language because they couldn't speak. So it's inherently built into us. We're compassionate like no other thing in the universe. God built into us a moral understanding. And there's no culture that, they're at war with some other culture and some soldiers out there, and he just leaves all his fellow soldiers and runs away. And everybody just says, oh man, what a great guy. He just looked out for himself. Nobody thinks that. we inherently know we should be sacrificing to help others. It's built into us. And nobody applauds cowardice and self-serving. We inherently know it's wrong. Why? He's helping himself. Because we inherently know that's not God's image. God is a humble God, and Jesus came to serve. And we have choice. We're primarily not ruled by our environment and our instincts. We are held accountable for our choices because we're given that. And then God warns us, obey. And anything else is rebellion and trying us to be God instead of God being God. So the problem is our sinful nature destroys all of these. We use our creativity to create pornography and evil. We use our communication for foul language and hatred. We turn compassion into self-serving, and we pretend we're just programmed like robots and driven by the environment, when really we have choice. So never forget you're made in the image of God. Never forget God's word means exactly what it says. And just because the world around us is trying to force everything they find into the Stone Age, followed by the Bronze Age, followed by the Iron Age, followed by the Modern Age, that's just fantasy to try to believe that apes turned into people. And all of these things I'm sharing show you it can't possibly be true. And they're just left out of the thinking of people in their education system. So, fun book. I probably only talked about 20% of the stuff that's in it. The curriculum I developed over a 3-year period, there's 18 lessons. This is just one of them. And they're filmed like on location, and you get to see all these artifacts more close up, and it's really fun to watch. So I'd put it to use. Some of the things on the table I'm out of, and if you want them, just sign up for my newsletter. If you do nothing else, sign up for my newsletter. It's free, comes out 4 times a year, and you can tell me what you're missing, and I'll send it out tomorrow when I get home, and you'll just get it this week. So anyway, thank you. I could actually, if you want, we could take a few questions, but I do want to get out of here at 12 or so, because I got an 11-hour drive home today. So any questions? Yes?
So are you saying it's 6,000 years is when it all started?
Absolutely. If you take the Bible to read like any other book you would pick up and say, well, it just means what it says. It says, God made Adam and Eve, and they had the son, Seth, and it was so many years. And then Seth had a son, and it was so many years, and all the way up to Noah. And you come up with about 2,000 years. And to Abraham. And then from Abraham to Jesus was about 2,000 years, and Jesus to us was about 2,000 years. Now, I'm a scientist. I see that biblically. I know what it says. But I've been trained to be really skeptical. And the whole world would say that's absurd. But then I've learned how dating methods work. And 2 of the 18 lessons in this deal with how do dating methods work. How does radiometric dating work? How does radiocarbon dating work? And the vast majority of dating methods, it's just the amount of something, like the amount of potassium or the amount of uranium, and the rate at which it changes into lead or whatever, and you divide the amount that's there by the rate at which it changes, and you come up with these huge time periods. But they're all involve assumptions that you had the same starting amount, the rate of transformation has never changed, and the vast majority of dating methods indicate this earth couldn't be millions of years old. They come up with very young dates. Like when radioactive change happens, uranium turns into lead, it produces helium. It's part of the process. You can't stop it. So the uranium's in the rock, it's changing into lead, and it's making helium, and the helium's trapped in the rock. Well, when we measure how much helium was made, how fast does it come out, so therefore how much should be left, it's the same, just as accurate of a dating method. It turns out those rocks turn out to be only 6,000 years old, not millions of years old. 2 different methods giving 2 different results. I choose to believe the one the Bible tells me about, but they're all estimates and assumptions. So, yet there is really good scientific evidence and reasons to believe a recent creation. And the other big one, we now find undecayed biological tissue in hundreds of fossils. We found dinosaur bones where you have blood vessels, you can stretch them and they'll snap right back. Undecayed bone-making osteocytes, nerve bundles running right through these fossils that are supposedly 60 to 100 million years old. We can measure how fast do these kind of things, how fast do proteins, how fast does DNA, how fast does this tissue disappear in a laboratory. And we know it couldn't be more than tens or hundreds of thousands of years old. It couldn't be millions of years old. Scientifically, we know this. And yet it's there in those bones. So there's a dating method that shows those rock layers can't be millions of years old. So yeah, I do believe the Bible means what it says. Creation was about 6,000 years ago. And one more clue. Jesus, when he was asked about marriage, this is Jesus. This is God walking here on earth, okay? And the Pharisees asked him about marriage, and he said, have you not read, at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female? Now, if the universe and the earth is billions of years old, and mankind appeared only about 100,000 or 6,000 years ago, why would Jesus say God made people at the beginning of creation if creation is billions of years old? You see what I mean? You've got all these biblical issues if you're not willing to believe it means what it actually says. And when you really study it, which most people don't, science really does agree with it. And most of it's just interpretation. Okay.
I have a question, just because, it has nothing to do.
Oh, whatever. Yeah.
How do you answer the question, if God made everything and everything is good, how did we get plastic and why is there so much of it? Just because this is a question I got yesterday. I do not know how to answer it.
Okay, let me make sure I understand your question. First of all, each literal, normal day where God did certain things during the week of creation, and it's presented that way, and there's no other biblical way to understand that means what it says. Most of the time he said, I've done this and it's good, I've done this and it's good. By the way, at the end of day 6, after he made mankind, he not only said it's good, he said it's very good, okay? So if that means there's been a billion years of death and disease and bloodshed and cancer and extinctions and all those rock layers just build up over millions and hundreds of millions of years as animals are wiping each other out, and we're all living on this huge fossil graveyard of death. And God looks at all that after he makes mankind and says, that's a very good creation. That's kind of a weird definition. So the original creation, and it's very clear in Genesis, there was no death. People ate plants, not animals. Animals ate plants, not animals. I think it was totally, almost incomprehensible. Operated different. I think the laws of science were different. Our abilities were different. And everything changed when we sinned. Because in order for there to be death, there had to be death across the entire creation. So God totally changed creation. So things that have happened since the fall are not necessarily good. Things have deteriorated. Things have gotten worse. Diseases have built in. Now you ask about plastics. How can there be all these billions of pounds of plastic, which aren't necessarily good? Well, they're not necessarily bad either. Plastics are just oils, and oils come from plants and dead animal bodies, and they're just strings of carbon that have been strung together. They can just come from available carbon into the ground under heat and pressure. And we've taken the stuff that occurs naturally, and using our creativity and understanding of how creation operates, we've been able to string them together to form very permanent, useful structures called plastics, polymers. Now, depending on how they're developed and what kind of stuff we add to them, and plasticizers and chemicals that make them last longer, they can turn out to be toxic, and they can turn out to be not very useful. But ultimately, they essentially end up back in the ground. So we've taken something out of the ground, we use it for very useful functions that benefit mankind, preserve food longer, help us to, protect and ship things, and then we put them back in the ground. And assuming we're not putting something in there that's toxic, we haven't done any harm. We're transferring one resource from one area, we're transforming and putting it back again. So I'm not so sure it's evil. And when we do find out it's harmful, I think unless we're driven by profit and don't care, and we're not taking good care and dominion over creation, we're not doing any harm. And I would hope when we find out it is, we change it and quit adding the things that do harm. So there's two ways of looking at that. Okay? Yeah. And it's always a cycle. And the problem is mankind is sinful, and we're driven by profit and self-serving and self-interest and greed. And more often than not, we do cause harm. And our job as Christians is to point those things out and try to correct them. And all of us aren't the same, and we're all called to different issues. But let's not wipe a whole activity and endeavor of humanity as bad when it's how it's being used is what's bad. Yeah. Yes. It is. It absolutely is.
Everything of this earth, everything on this earth is of this earth. It doesn't matter if it's plastic or fuel or whatever.
It's being transformed, one form to another.
We're just changing.
And I don't think there's not anything inherently wrong with what you're describing. It's what are the impacts, and are the impacts, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
And that if any gland or any organ or any part of the animal wasn't there, they weren't to survive. And where are all these missing fossils?
Oh, there's not one missing link, there's a million missing links. Yeah.
These humans that were born without lungs, humans that were born without brains, humans that were born without kidneys, humans that were born without...
They don't survive. Yeah, you
plenty of evidence of all these
yeah.
miscalculations.
There is. And honestly, you can go on and on and on. You could. Just example after example after example after example of how the information, the complexity, the organs, the parts, the information, the cell structure, none of it could make itself. That wasn't the point of this morning. I have other lectures that talk about that, but you're absolutely right. None of it can be explained. Yes. Yep. I mean, this is probably the last comment I'm going to make. We have now decoded the genetic sequence of chimpanzees, okay, and apes. There's about 3 billion letters. We've uncoded the genetic sequence of the human being, and it's about the same ballpark. And it used to be said that the DNA of an ape was in the range of 98 or 99% identical to human beings. Well, now that and that was said long before we had the whole code sequenced out. Well, now that we've decoded it, there's somewhere between, and if it's 3 billion letters long, there's somewhere between 300 million and 600 million differences, if you just line up the letters, between an ape and a human being. And all of those 300 million letters and words and sentences and paragraphs and chapters that are in the human being are totally missing from the ape. We can't even explain how one sentence, if you have a book that's 3 billion letters long, and there's 100 or 300 million letters that are different, you can't even explain how one sentence could have completely disappeared from the ape, and a totally new sentence that has a useful functional purpose could have reappeared in the human being. And you don't find that sentence anywhere in all the ape and chimpanzee DNA in the whole world. It's just totally disappeared. It can't be explained. So it is now genetically absurd to pretend and continue to teach that this is true. But the only alternative is that human beings just suddenly appeared. And that's not scientific. It can't be tested. You can't go to a laboratory to show it. You don't have any evidence for that actual event happening. So it's assumed that the other one must be true, even though we haven't yet figured it out. And that's the way science operates. And it's because they're not looking for the truth, they're just looking for a way to support a belief system that it all happened without God. And even Christians get sucked into it, because they only hear one-sided information growing up. Their churches don't often bring speakers in to talk about it. The pastors compromise and they say, well, maybe God used evolution. And by the time they get out of college, they just assume it's an absolute fact. And then they go on to become church leaders, even if they're Christians. And ultimately, more and more people get deceived. So, okay. Thank you for the questions and comments. Okay. So I'll be back at the book table